Welcome back, everyone, to another video for the New Order, Old War Blues, or just the New Order. And in this one, as you can see, we are looking at Russia. Now, you may see that there's a lot of Russians. Let's explain what's going on with all of them. As you may or may not know, some of these factions are inspired by real life things. Some of them are invented, but we're going to take a look at all of them, their inspiration, and hopefully some of their in-game roles, despite the fact that this is obviously still relatively classified as the mod is in development. So we do not know all that much about them, except for some warlords we have some descriptions, some events, obviously the leader, the party, the politics. But other than that, we don't have the focus trees, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, very, very speculative. Let's start geographically. Western Russia. Our first Russian warlord is actually Ania Gap over here. The faction takes its name from the coastal town of Ania, which is the capital, as you can see, on the banks of the river Ania, which goes into Ania Bay. You may notice something. Its territory reaches also all the way to Lake Ania in the west. So yes, they really like Ania. Ania town itself is a tiny settlement, but it has a history, an ancient history dating back to the colonization of the extreme north of Russia by settlers from the Merchant Republic of Novgorod, which is somewhere over here. I think it's been renamed to Holmgard in here, but yeah. Which also resulted in the founding of the more famous Arkhangelsk. We know practically nothing about their goals, except that they are definitely aligned with Finland. The leader is Nikolai Amelin, who in real life was a Soviet military officer and a hero of the Soviet Union. He was born in this region of sort of Karelia. He fought against Finland in the Winter War and the Continuation War, even commanding a unit belonging to the short-lived army of the Finnish Democratic Republic, which was the Soviet puppet state that was supposed to replace the Republic of Finland in the Winter War. He received the state's highest awards for heroism in the fighting of the Great Patriotic War. Given his in-real-life history of actually fighting Finland, it's relatively ironic that in the New Order, he seems to be allied with Finland, seeing that Finland is guaranteeing the independence of Ania, and they have military access in Ania, and also descriptions related to Ania, do talk about Finland. So, yes. These guys are definitely Finnish aligned. They likely see him as a buffer against the West Russian Revolutionary Front, seeing as Finland controls a lot of Russian territory over here, as you can see. The Finnish-sponsored ruling party is the Единая Волонтерская Anti-Коммунистическая Гвардия, so the United Volunteer Anti-Communist Guard, which dominates the state apparatus. And some complain, obviously, about the dominance of Finland's interest, but, again, Finland holds a lot of Russian territory with Russian Karelians living in them, so the fate of the Russian Karelians is partly linked to Ania, and the one-sided partnership with Finland can have the upside of providing protection for these Russians. The next warlord is Vologda. Vologda, over here, is an ancient city, very, very ancient, which was actually chosen already in Russia's ancient history by Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, as the center of the short-lived Oprichnina system of state-sponsored militias, state police. It controls a wide and sparsely populated territory, as you can see, in the north of Russia. And it is able to influence the smaller neighbor Kostroma. As you can see, Kostroma is guaranteed by Vologda. The leader is Vasily Ivanov, who in real life was a Red Army artilleryman and a hero of the Soviet Union. He later actually even served in the strategic rocket forces, so I wonder if we're going to see anything related to that in the later game content, if Vologda is able to do anything. General Ivanov has decreed the cessation of fighting in the sector under his command, and he is trying to create the conditions for trade and development which will aid in the battle against the Germans, which are his immediate neighbors. The leading faction is the Sili Поддержания Мероприятка в России, which is essentially the forces for the support of the order in Russia, kind of, basically, something like that. And they are authoritarian democratic, as you can see. They're, of course, a one-party state, though. Their little brother is Kostroma, or Kostroma. I have not looked at the pronunciation for it, so I am very sorry. It is the only town of Russia's historical heartland cities, or the Golden Ring, which is to the northeast of Moscow, to still be in Russian control, so it probably had some kind of cultural significance. In legend, it is home actually to the Russian folk hero Ivan Susanin, whose tale kind of symbolizes Russian craftiness and resilience in the face of invasion. And of course, they sit right on the border with Germany. It is stated that Kostroma is relatively prosperous, and it is able to actually conduct trade with towns in the Reichskommissariat Moscow. And they are protected, as you saw, by their bigger neighbor Vologda. So they are able to more peacefully develop without having to worry about their own defense. The leader is Sergei Bolshakov, or Bolshakov, depending again on the pronunciation. He was in real life predictably a hero of the Soviet Union and a commander of an anti-tank artillery unit in the Great Patriotic War. The leading faction, as you can see, is the Partia Demokratii и Нейтралитета, which you can probably surmise means the party of democracy and neutrality. Despite being ruled by a democratic party, as you can see, conservative democracy, they are actually a one-party state. Going south, we have Gorky down here, and this is where things start to get seriously interesting, because we start to get a little bit more fantasy thrown in. So Gorky is a big Russian city, unlike these other ones. It's an important industrial center. The city was called Nizhny Novgorod before the revolution, and renamed Gorky after the famous writer Maxim Gorky, a famous pro-revolutionary writer. This was in the 1930s that the renaming happened. It was a very important industrial center in the USSR, and it especially became home to vehicle industries, automotive, such as the Gorkovsky Automobilny Zavod, the Gorky Automobile Factory, which is abbreviated as GAZ. You probably have seen vehicles produced by GAZ in various games detailing the Soviet military, because they produced essentially the Russian equivalent of the Jeeps. And it produced, also civilian cars, military transport trucks, armored cars, even light tanks, and the Su-76 assault gun.
Su-76 moving. Get this Suchka moving. Su-76 relocating.
Another notable factory in the city is the Red Sormovo factory, which was actually born as a riverine shipyard. As you can see, the city is essentially right along a major river, the Don and the Volga. As you can see, the major rivers. And this is one of the tributaries of the Volga, which is actually comes from the Urals. But yeah, I'm not 100% on the name of the river right now because I am an ignorant little pig. But yes, should have done my research. But yes, so it was born as a riverine shipyard, but it came to produce the Russian copy of the FD-17 tank after the revolution, which was called actually the Yenin Freedom Fighter or something, and later obviously the T-34. These industries actually remain functional in the TNO timeline, and they allowed the Gorky Warlord clique to equip mechanized forces to stage raids on RK Moscow, Reichskommissariat Moscovian. So they are quite the powerhouse. The tanks in its factories have become important enough that the city-state actually has a tank on Green Field as its banner. The leader of the city is actually fittingly a former tankist, Nikolai Averyan Stepanovich. He fought in the Great Patriotic War in an Su-76 assault gun, and he received posthumously, because he died in the war, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. In our timeline, he was also a member of the Communist Party and a former NKVD policeman. But actually, despite this, in TNO, he is a supporter of Tsar Vladimir's claim to the throne of Russia and his government in Vyatka, as indicated by the name of the ruling party. As you can see, the ruling party is despotist, and they are called the Storoniki Tsarya Vladimira, which in Russian means the supporters of Tsar Vladimir. Tsar Vladimir being the leader of Vyatka over here, and obviously he's running a government there to try to restore the Russian Empire. Interestingly, if we take a look at the other warlords that we have examined earlier, we can see that there is a powerful, existing authoritarian socialist faction, which, as you can see there, it's ZRF, which means Zapadno-Rossiyskiy Revolutionary Front, the West Russian Revolutionary Front, which is obviously supposed to represent support for the faction over here that we're going to take a look at later. The Gorky authoritarian socialist faction is called the Gorkovsky Soviet. Now, this means the Gorky Council. The Soviet is a representative council which houses delegates which are directly chosen by the workers of a given factory, city district, or the soldiers of a battalion or a regiment. And they were born, obviously, in both the Russian revolutions, 1905 and 1917. So the fact that this revolutionary institution has survived in Gorky, it seems to function, as indicated by the name of the party. Again, it's just speculation. Possibly means that despite the reactionary leadership of Gorky, perhaps because of the importance of the industry, obviously the automotive industry that's still running, the vehicle industry, the tanks, the Gorky Soviet still has a role actually in governing the city and maintaining it to function, because something like a strike or an occupation of the factories could cripple the economy, which, you know, in the path of the focus tree, which we're going to see once the mod releases, might actually have repercussions. We might see a path for the Gorky Soviet to rule over the city. Now, we move further east, along, obviously, the rivers, and we see Kazan. Now, let's take a look at Kazan. Kazan is the capital city of the modern Republic of Tatarstan in the Russian Federation, and it is also the ancient capital of the Kazan Khanate, which was for centuries at the crossroads between European Russia and sort of Central Asia, Asian Russia. Obviously, Central Asia being over here, Asian Russia being east of the Ural Mountains. And still today, the population is actually split between ethnic Russians and ethnic Tatars. Tatar is just a word for essentially a type of inner Asian ethnicity. The cities actually became obviously a transportation hub because of its location, and consequently became very industrialized in the period of the late Russian Empire and the subsequent era subsequent to the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is actually quite represented in the game. As you can see, they do have quite a sizable industry. They also have the They also have basic mechanization and a nascent industrial base in their societal development, so they are not to be trifled with. It is also home to steel production, as you can see, and a high population because it is a major center, just like Gorky. So that's obviously adding to their power. The warlord is General Pyotr Gavrilov, who in our timeline was a T-34 tank commander who served in the Caucasus, in Belarus, and the Baltics, and he became a member of an elite guards brigade and predictably a hero of the Soviet Union. He has actually stayed faithful to the Soviet state, as you can see, and his ruling party is the Западный революционный фронт, as you can see, the West Russian Revolutionary Front. So he is a part of this faction, and presumably if the West Russians expand all the way to his borders, he's going to join them. And Kazan will likely be the front's sword in sort of central Russia, if obviously the state doesn't fall prey to agitation from other factions or invasion, which is a real possibility, actually, considering that they have a neighbor, which is a Tatar ethnic state, whose ruling Tatar Independence Party, which we're going to take a look at soon, actually has a large base of support in Kazan, as you can see, 32%. So let's take a look at the Tatar state. In the present-day Russian Federation, Tatarstan is actually a federative subject. It is a republic which is directly under the Federation, and its capital is Kazan. But in here, lacking, and also Kazan is the city with the highest population of ethnic Tatars in Russia. But lacking that city, the Tatar state in TNO has set up to the neighboring city of Ufa, which actually today in modern Russia is the capital of another ethnic republic, the Republic of Bashkortostan, the federal entity which represents Russia's Bashkir ethnicity. Even though here it is Tatar, if you take a look at here, there's the Uralic culture everywhere else, which most likely represents the Bashkirs, which is another minority ethnicity in the area. Despite this, the majority population of the city of Ufa today is actually split between Russian and Tatars. However, it is the countryside that is mostly Bashkir. The Tatars are actually a historic thorn inside of Russia. The steppe nomads in general on the eastern frontier of most Russian states based around Moscow, Kiev, and sort of the Eastern Slavic heartland have a history of conflict. The conflict with Tatars is part of the Russian historic consciousness and has been so for over 1,000 years as a potential threat. So much so that actually Russia's national epic, the Tale of Igor's Campaign, is about the struggle against one such nomadic people in the steppes, mostly around the Don area, but it is sort of Russia's historic battle against the nomads coming from the east. So the Tatars and other inner Asian ethnic groups, such as the Bashkirs, were both heavily suppressed in the Russian state's eastward march after the destruction of the Khanate of Kazan by Ivan the Terrible's troops, and the subsequent advance towards Siberia and Central Asia. And over the centuries of this eastern expansion, they became eventually a part of the modern Russian state, with the aristocracy actually being integrated into the Russian one and coming to form a part of the Russian national identity. During the Russian Revolution, despite this later integration, there were attempts to revive the Tatar state, which is called the Idel-Ural state, in this area, meant to also include the other ethnicities, such as the Bashkirs. But in 1918 and 1920, all those years, the Red Army, the nascent Red Army, was able to suppress them successfully. The warlord of the Tatars over here, Sapir Akhtyamov, is particularly another hero of the Soviet Union in real life. While Kazan emphasizes obviously the Soviet legacy of the Tatar Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ufa-based Tatarstan seems to emphasize and combine Tatar ethnic ambitions with anti-communism, like the unfortunate and short-lived Idel-Ural state of 1917. Tatarstan seems to actually have access to a decent amount of resources, industry, and power, but they are weaker than their Western neighbor, its Soviet rival. So it would be interesting to see who they turn to in their quest to claim Kazan, its capital, and independence, or at least autonomy, for these ethnicities. The ruling party is the Tatar Independence Party, as you can see, the Tatarskaya Partiya Nezavizhnosti, which just means the Tatar Party of Independence. for independence, obviously. And in the state, obviously, the West Russian Revolutionary Front holds also a strong influence, so this is a mutual thing. Next up, we go south, and we find Samara, whose leaders have quite the rich backstory. As we can see, they are fascist. Samara, in Soviet time, was actually known as the city of Kuibyshev, after a famous revolutionary, and it is the major political center on the lower Volga area. It was chosen actually in the Second World War by Stalin as a secondary backup capital in case Moscow fell to the Germans. And in the TNO timeline, however, it is occupied by the government of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, Комитет освобождения народов России, which was an in real life collaborationist organization. So this is pretty much the first faction that is really based in history. Well, Kazan also, and Tatarstan also, but in the time period. And this government was really formed in real life, except it obviously failed because their German sort of puppet masters failed as well. The stated goals of this committee were the destruction of Soviet Russia and the construction of a Russian state that would do away with both the Soviet system and Western plutocracies. Again, whatever those are, the fascists really like to speak about those. The goals stated in the group's manifesto are influenced both by Nazi ideology and by white Russian emigre thinking. Now, after the 1917 revolutions, both the February and the October, a large wave of pro-monarchist, reactionary, and later, after the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917, also pro-Republican Russians who obviously later supported the White armies against the Red Army, fled Russia into Europe, mostly in Paris, Berlin, and they developed a lot of different political philosophies to explain what happened to them and how for them to regain control of Russia in one way or another. And Andrei Vlasov, who in the beginning was a Soviet general, was partly influenced by some of this white immigrant Russian nationalist ideology, and also partially influenced by his German clients. And this program included things like the restoration of private capitalism, coexisting with wide social programs in the vein of usual fascism, and the return of freedom of religion and traditional Russian family values, again, whatever those are. To do this, during the war, Vlasov was allowed by none other than Heinrich Himmler, over here, to create actually a Russian liberation army, Российская освободительная армия, if I recall correctly the name, or ROA. This ROA was formed from the scattered groups of Russians that had been captured and had defected to the Germans. In real life, this army was first employed in anti-partisan warfare, then shipped to the Western Front, where they defended the beaches of Normandy when they became politically unreliable and started to defect back to Soviet troops when the Soviets started winning the war. And then, in the final days of the war, they were again transferred to Eastern Europe and eventually turned on the Germans and sided with Czech partisans in the Prague uprising in the final days of the war. This, however, did not save them from their past crimes, and many of them, including Vlasov, were extradited to the Soviet Union and executed for treason. In the TNO timeline, Vlasov and his semi-ragtag army have been installed in the Volga metropolis by the Germans, likely after the major off-screen event of the West Russian War in the 1950s, in which it is confirmed that Vlasov's liberation army took part, and they support Reichskommissariat Moscovian's eastern flank and help it control the Volga for the Reich. It is stated that in the in-game description, as we can see, that Andrei Vlasov is seen as a weak leader due to his lack of success in these 10, 15 or so years that he has been trying to reunite Russia under his government. It is likely that, thanks to German support, the armed forces, which we do not know what they're going to be, but it is likely that they will be at least, some. They will at least be better organized than some of the other warlords. But with Kazan and Gorky as neighbors, it's probably going to be difficult for Vlasov to expand without a strong Germany supporting him. However, this is speculation. We'll see about that in the future. They also have quite a sizable support for other factions in their realm. And actually the biggest one of these is the supporters of the Tsar Vladimir. So who knows? Maybe some kind of alliance can be struck with the Tsar. Another fascist faction that we are going to check out is the Aryan Brotherhood.
We must prepare for a great war, the final war, and it will end with the triumph of our race. The mailed fist of the legions of Reich will challenge our enemies, and if the jackals will not surrender these 6, we will take it by force! Hell Reich!
Now, this one is pretty much fully made up. Unlike some of these other factions that we took a look at, which are based regionally, after a city or a region, or an ethnicity, or I don't know, or a real-life organization or party, the Aryan Brotherhood is completely made up. They're basically just Nazi cosplayers, as you can see. The Aryan Brotherhood actually thinks that Slavs can become Aryans, despite the Germans saying explicitly that this cannot happen, and consider themselves an equal partner to the Germans. Their military actually is made up of a bunch of militias that are, to their credit, quite well trained. But they don't seem to have any support really outside their controlled territory. If we can see the other fascists and national socialists around them don't really follow their particular version of it. We're going to see those party names later. Only 3% in the faction to the north, Pierre. So yeah, they're pretty much secluded to Perm and the surrounding countryside. Perm, obviously, a bit of a far away from like the main towns, but sort of an industrial center, so they do have some resources to use there. Their leader is actually his real name is Alexander Yegorovich Medvedev, not to be confused with other Alexander Medvedevs, who in real life was a Red Army artilleryman and a hero of the Soviet Union. In the TNR universe, he has actually changed his name to the German Andreas Meyer, as you can see, which is quite interesting. Obviously, he is a bit of a German fanboy. The current leader of the Aryan Brotherhood actually used to be a Russian officer like any other. However, supposedly as the German ties swept over the Soviet Union, shattering the Soviet Union, he didn't flee with his other comrades and maybe join the Russian Revolutionary Front. No, instead he examined the invasion, and in awe of the perceived success of the German invasion, he began to think, what if the invader was right? What if the Germans really are superior? So, according to Meyer, historical characters like Peter the Great, who were Russian, became Aryans themselves. And if Peter the Great did it, so could all worthy Russians. And so the only salvation for the Russian people is to all become Aryans themselves and become an equal partner to Germany. So yeah, these guys are fucking insane. The third fascist state that we're going to take a look at is just to the north of the Aryan Brotherhood. However, this one is very different from the others. Bierezniki. While the Aryan Brotherhood is simply copying National Socialism from Germany, and Vlasov's Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia is combining German and Russian ideology, The rulers of Berezniki, the Mladarossi Union, or Tsarsky Soyuz Mladarossi, are fully indigenous Russian ideology. The Young Russia movement, Mladarossi, it means. They were born in the White Russian emigre movement in terms of intellectual origin and also where their political beginnings are. They were part of the essentially expats that fled away from Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, as a faction that advocated a weird form of government. They advocated the Tsarist restoration, so restoration of some kind of Tsar of Russia, but also the maintaining of the Soviet form of government. Now, the Soviets, as we saw, are a legislative and sometimes also executive body made up of representatives that are chosen by the people of a given production unit or village or whatever. Their motto even was Tsar I Sovieti, Tsar and Soviets. So they advocated for a synthesis of these two, both the monarchy and the extreme democracy of the Soviets. They thought that the Soviet form of government was the expression of true Russian political thinking, true Russian ideology, and popular will. And it could only be fully developed under the other expression of historic expression of Russian statecraft, which is the monarchy, rather than the Stalinist regime, which their leader Alexander Kazanbek, which we can see over here, defined as a plutocratic regime by nature. They actually thought that the Soviet Union was plutocratic, and that the socialist revolution was national in character rather than social, and the regime that had emerged from it had in some way preserved Russian national interests. So unlike other emigre communities, many other the dominant, obviously, thinking among these refugees of the Soviet Union who had lost their families, possessions, and privileges in the Soviet Revolution, they were for maintaining the Soviet Union and supporting the Soviet Union just with a monarchy. So they were part, actually, of a larger sort of tendency within the White Russian emigre movement. They weren't the only ones that in some way supported a continuation of the Soviet political structure. They were actually alongside schools such as Trubetskoy's Eurasianists, who are referenced in Kaiserreich, actually, and Ustrielov's Smienovyhovtsi, which is a really difficult name. We can actually see these guys, I believe, in Vologda. We take a look at here. This political faction, yeah, over here, Neosmini, but we want the full name now, do we? Maybe in Callme we're gonna have a better... Where is it? Yeah, Neosmienovichovsi. This unpronounceable faction's name roughly translates to era changers or epoch changers, and they were another ideological movement that spawned out of the Russian emigration, whose positions and policies could kind of be compared to the Mladarossi. After the rise of fascism in, obviously the 20s and 30s, they eagerly took up some of the tenets of the ideology, such as corporatism, and they similarly preached class collaboration and regarded the national state as an entity above and beyond all the people. For them, they also believed that the state was superior to race, which was part of the reason why they opposed the National Socialist version of fascism. And they generally supported the Allies during the Second World War. Many of them actually became involved with, for example, the French Resistance, the English intelligence, and they supported, in general, the Soviet Union, holding true to their sort of credentials of Russian patriots against the expansionist Germany. Their ideal Russian state would have been a centralized, politically authoritarian, while socially and economically progressive empire with non-Russian ethnicities enjoying autonomous subject status, because they had obviously this belief of, the Russian form of government is this Tsar and Soviets, so other ethnic groups that are still part of Russia, that are still part of the geopolitical Russian Empire, they're going to have their own versions of this government form. So it would have been both. It would have had both elements of federalism and, you know, been highly centralized. So yeah, these guys just like to mix everything. In the TNO timeline, it's safe to say that the Second Soviet Party, as they refer to themselves, after obviously the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, has a chance to create its Frankenstein state superstructure, mostly due to Soviet Russia's implosion. So the first Soviet Party is, you know, rather reduced in power. However, their domain is actually limited to a small city, Berezniki, secluded on the western slopes of the Ural Mountains, and thus their manpower and industry are quite limited at the start. Berezniki actually was once part of Vladimir's empire, little petty empire. As you can see, he is over here doing his thing. They were once part of it. However, Kazan Bek, who was once an advisor to Tsar Vladimir, wishes to conquer now Vyatka in order to force Vladimir to work with him on his vision, because he is obviously you could say, disillusioned that the Tsar wasn't listening to him. Historically, the Union of Mladosi actually supported the claim of Vladimir's father, Kirill, over the imperial throne, and so both Tsar Vladimir and Kazan Bek have factions that are represented in the opposing statelet. As you can see, the TVL, or supporters of loyalists of Tsar Vladimir, are present in Berezniki, and the TSM, or Tsarsky Soyuz Mladarusi, is supported somewhat in Vyatka. Speaking of Vyatka, let's take a look at them. The bastion of Russian monarchism. On the death, actually, of his father, Kirill, in 1938, Vladimir Kirillovich Romanov became the head of the Russian imperial family. At that moment, Soviet power was firmly in control of his house's ancient empire, and it looked to stay that way. The Second World War, however, changed that. If we took a look at the in-game description, which is relatively long, we get a decent idea of what's going on. Initially offered the regency of Ukraine, which was occupied by the Germans, Grand Duke Vladimir refused, choosing instead to declare eternal friendship and cooperation with Nazi Germany in 1943. This was most likely to avoid sectioning off Russia. Obviously, you know, Ukraine supposed to be part of the Russian Empire in the eyes of this guy. Residing in occupied France, the Duke conducted regular radio broadcasts to the Russian people in which he actively encouraged them to welcome the German Crusaders with open arms and to rise up against the tyranny and cruelty of Bolshevism. In the early 50s, it was during the West Russian Offensive, the West Russian War, obviously by the West Russian Revolutionary Front, in case you haven't had enough of that, that Vladimir finally convinced the Germans to send him back to his homeland as one of the leaders of the German counter-offensive. But as the German advance ground to a halt, and the Duke pressed on, breaking through Red Menace lines and establishing a pocket of monarchism in Russia for the first time since the Civil War. As Vladimir I, the new Tsar has so far had little success in expanding his petty empire, and the Germans have discarded him as quickly as they propped him up once the Red threat was isolated in Arkhangelsk. So he is trying to restore the old Russian Empire. He has quite a few supporters around, such as Gorky, potentially Berezniki, and there seem to be pro-Tsar factions in most of these small warlord states scattered about. But at the same time, and potentially also Tatarstan may become an ally of his, who knows. But again, he seems to be quite isolated and surrounded by enemies, the West Russians to the north and Samara to the south, in case he cannot strike up a deal with them. And obviously Aryan Brotherhood, Berezniki, and the various Ural factions to the east, and Gayinsky to the northeast. We're going to take a look at them soon. So yeah, he starts in a very probably difficult position, but Vyatka is nothing to laugh at in terms of resources, so maybe he can do something. Let's round up our list of readouts of reaction with Gayinsky. So here we have the fundamentalist Orthodox monastic order. ruling the town of Gayinsky over here. The Order of Saint George, Orden Sviatova Georgia. They seek to return to Russia's roots as a land of faith to destroy both the German invaders and the scourge of communism. In real life, the Order of St. George is actually the highest military decoration of the Russian Federation and used to be of the Russian Empire. And you've probably actually seen its sort of characteristic red and black stripes, its iconic imagery in official iconography celebrating Russia's military, military victories, not just of the Russian Empire or the Russian Federation, also of the Soviet Union. For example, whenever there's celebrations for Dien Победы, Victory Day, May 9th, with the big parades and Red Square and stuff like that, often what they're having for official sort of iconography again is Dien Победы, you know, for Victory Day, Happy Victory Day, with like red and black stripes in the background. You've probably seen this a few times, and you probably recognize it. However, the origins, this was not a military order in the sense of a structure and organization. It was a military order in the sense of awards given to famous leaders. Its roots lie actually in Catherine the Great's time, and only Russia's most victorious, glorious leaders can aspire to become Knights of St. George. However, there was never like a true militant order on the basis of something like the Teutonic Knights based on St. George in the Orthodox tradition. This organization and structure are alien to the Orthodox Church, but obviously this order is drawing upon a rich tradition and a powerful message. Nor is it the first time, actually, that Orthodox holy men take up arms in defense of the faith. Battle priests were actually common in the Balkan Wars of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, and the various Balkan wars fought between the little kingdoms and statelets of the Balkans. And they also probably existed in Russia's ancient past, at least in legends. Actually, warrior priests are a common sight in these tales about old battles. Most famously is actually the story of the monk Pierre, who was chosen to face a Tatar champion in single combat before the Battle of Kulikovo Polye along the Don River in 1380, which was the first engagement in which Russian forces were able to defeat a Mongol army of the Golden Horde. So yes, the idea of a monk fighting in battle for the glorious Holy Rus is nothing really too strange for a Russian. In the chaos of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the theocratic state set up in Gayinsky was formed by former Soviet soldier Mikhail Antipin, who managed to achieve authority among the locals by fighting bandits in the northern part of the Perm region, which you can see as this one, in the 50s. So their idea is to cleanse all the infidels and establish a great Russia ruled by the church and defended militarily by the Knights of St. George. Then we move to a very interesting Callme. Callme is the only entity in Western Russia that has actually adopted a representative democracy as its government form. It is also supremely politically divided, as you can see from the chart, as a result, and has been stated to have the possibility to actually go with every single ideology in the game, so they will be quite interesting to play, certainly. Callme, as a political entity in real life in our world, was born in the USSR as a representative for the Komi Uralic ethnicity that lives in the northern Russian regions, the Komi minority. And the town of Syktyvkar is the capital city, as you can see. The city's political system obviously allows multi-party democracy, the only one that does this. Multi-party politics, wait, hold on, what? Hello, okay. Multi-party politics, which means that pretty much most of the factions operating in the wastelands of the Russian state are represented, including the fascist Committee for the for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, and the actually CL over here stands for Chornaya Liga, Black League, which comes from Omsk, as you can see. So, scary, scary, scary. And we're gonna take a look at Omsk in the future as well. The ultranationalists, the socialist factions in Callme are quite interesting, because one of them is the Zhdanovite Guard, Zhdanovskaya Gvardia, which presumably has something to do with either the in real life Stalin loyalist Andrei Zhdanov, sort of Soviet ideologue, or his son Yuri Zhdanov, who was actually a chemist and briefly married to Stalin's daughter Svetlana Stalina. Considering that this faction is actually libertarian socialist, as you can see, it is kind of unlikely that it is made of followers of the real-life Zhdanov father, Zhdanov Sr., unless in the TNO timeline his positions are like drastically different from our timeline. The other faction is named after the in real life ideologue and long-lived statesman of the Soviet Union, Suslov, Mikhail Suslov, sort of supporter of Soviet exceptionalism in the Eastern Bloc, and the Suslovtsi Bureaukrati, the Suslov bureaucrats, essentially. The leader of the state himself is Nikolai Voznesensky, who in real life actually headed the Gosplan, the state planning agency, economic planning agency, during the Second World War. He essentially was in this role. His faction are called the Voznesensky, or the Voznesensites, essentially, the supporters of Voznesensky, and they are social democrats. However, Callme can also is confirmed to have the possibility to have either Bukharin's or Stalin's daughter as its leader. So essentially, it's the one-stop shop for Soviet waifus, and Bukharin in this timeline and timeline of TNO became the leader of the USSR, and obviously Stalin was an important political figure in the USSR, so looks like Callme, with its sort of vibrant and potentially unstable political life, can have quite a lot of interesting things happen to it. Now we get to the big boy, the West Russian Revolutionary Front, hidden up in Arkhangelsk, the city of Archangel. In the far north of Russia. They're probably the biggest player in Western Russian theater. They're the remnant of the once mighty workers and peasants Red Army, led by the Marshal of the Soviet Union, Kliment Voroshilov. Unlike presumably most other Russian warlords, the Revolutionary Front can not only trace a direct line of descendants from the Soviet state, it has also fought the German invader and has gone on the offensive against it in the major, off-screen event, the West Russian War in the early 50s. 52 or something. During this war, the Russians actually managed to set the Wehrmacht running and liberate a lot of Russia from German occupation, almost nearly breaking German power for good and retaking Moscow and Leningrad. However, the Germans managed to push the front's forces back north, but they have been dealt a sort of irrecoverable blow, and by 1962, much thanks to the sacrifice of the Russian Revolutionary Front, the Reich is only a shadow of its former self. This success, however, came at a great cost to the Red Army, and so they are pushed back. The direct control of the West Russian Revolutionary Front is pushed back to the northern port of Arkhangelsk, where maybe they can receive supplies from the United States of America, who knows. All the while, the front's marshals, the main strongmen, Kliment Voroshilov, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, and Georgy Zhukov, are at odds to the future of the front and as to the future of Russia as a whole, the whole Soviet Union. In addition, these three strongmen are all kind of aging. However, most visibly is Kliment Voroshilov, who at the beginning of the game is almost 82 because he was born in 1889, I believe. He's old. The West Russian Revolutionary Front, obviously, because of its location, doesn't really start with the most powerful industry at all. But they most likely will have the sort of largest military of all these Russian remnants, and definitely they have a high political leverage. They are, because of their legacy of actually battling the Germans and their legacy of being the successors of the Soviet Union, so the constituted regime, they probably have a lot of political leverage. As you can see, the Revolutionary Front is widely represented among the various factions of the post-Soviet hellscape. They are present pretty much everywhere, and they are probably the prime candidate for the reunification of Russia and then the Soviet Union. The front's two runner-up marshals, the second in commands, Tukhachevsky and Georgy Zhukov, both have control over a puppet state of the front, which are the other two warlords that, we're not going to take a look at because they're effectively part of the front. They are a military district, which is a reference to an in real life Soviet military institution. And yeah, so Tukhachevsky is in Kotlas, while Georgy Zhukov is in Ukhta. And yeah, so Tukhachevsky's government has an interesting thing about it. They are not authoritarian or libertarian socialist. They are despotism. Now there are a few post-Soviet states that sort of still keep their Soviet loyalty, their Soviet symbols, their Red Army, their Communist Party of the Soviet Union and all, but they are not represented as socialists in the game. That is because while they are loyal to the USSR, they don't actually employ socialist policies. That has been stated by the developers. So they're kind of a straight-up junta or a military regime. So you have authoritarian democracies like Konstantin Rokossovsky's Sverdlovsk. I believe you also have something of the sort in the Far East. No, actually, Gerek is authoritarian socialist. And yeah, you have the despotic clique of Ochirov in Aldan. And you also have Vorkuta, which is an authoritarian democracy with the Red Navy actually in charge. We're going to take a look at them later. And you also have the despotic, as you can see, Tukhachevsky clique. So you have despotic and authoritarian democratic states that are actually loyal to a Soviet Union that is long gone and will probably join the West Russian Revolutionary Front if they do well. Or they will become it in case of Tukhachevsky, because Tukhachevsky and Zhukov are sort of competing to be the successor to Kliment Voroshilov. Zhukov's government instead is represented as a libertarian socialist, and so they're going to support a more pluralistic open system for the Soviet Union if they do indeed win.